Good evening to those here with us in person and those joining online. I am Sarah Elliott Holliday from the library's events staff, and it's my pleasure to welcome Adam Van Doren back to the library. He spoke here in 2016 on his beautiful volume, The House Tells the Story, Homes of the American Presidents, on which he collaborated with David McCullough. Tonight, Adam will be speaking on his new book, In the Founder's Footsteps, Landmarks of the American Revolution, which is his fourth book. It chronicles in both words and paintings his journey throughout the United States in search of historic sites that bear the marks of the 7-year War of Independence. Since this library was founded 20-odd years prior to the war, and our collections include a great many books on related subjects from the Revolutionary period to the present, it's an especially ideal period for us to revisit this evening. We do have copies of In the Founder's Footsteps for sale through our friends from the Corner Bookstore following the presentation, just in the rear of this room, and online, in the link in the chat. Adam Van Doren studied at Columbia University, where he received his master's in architecture, and he now teaches at Yale University, where he is an associate fellow. Adam comes from a long line of distinguished authors and historians, including his grandfather, Mark Van Doren, and his great-uncle, Carl Van Doren, best-selling biographer of Benjamin Franklin. Both of them were recipients of the Pulitzer Prize. Adam has been a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome and has exhibited at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., among other institutions. His work is included in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Wadsworth Atheneum, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. He is also the author of The Stones of Yale and an artist in Venice. He's a native of Boston, where, fittingly enough, the revolution first began. However, he has asked me to report to you that regrettably he has left his musket and wig at home. Please join me in welcoming Adam Van Doren.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for coming. This is a very appropriate place. You all hear okay? Very appropriate place to give this talk and talk about this book, given the history of the library, which precedes the revolution. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for coming. I would like to give a little introduction and then show quickly a number of images from the book, rather than go through every single one of them in detail. I'll give you thumbnail sketches about them, literally. And, oops, I didn't do anything, did you?
Nope, I did, my bad. Just
and then I thought I would read an excerpt of an excerpt, just a snippet of one essay for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I will be glad to answer any questions if anyone has it, and then, of course, be willing to sign a book if you're interested in the back. Sarah alluded to an earlier book I did on Homes of American Presidents, which I worked on with the historian David McCullough. This is sort of a sequel to that. I had gone to various homes of certain founding fathers to be included in that book, and I thought this was a natural segue to explore further into that period, which interests me. As in both cases, I did paintings and wrote essays to accompany them. It was a daunting task to take on this particular book. I got in over my head when I started realizing how much history I needed to know, and I almost said, forget it, this is nuts. But when I thought to myself, it's not just about the battles which I wasn't as familiar with, or the the progressions of military strategy that were associated with revolution. That period was also about arts and culture, which history should be part of. So I tried to incorporate that in the book, and that gave me an inspiration that I could do this. I know a lot about that. But I did do a lot of research. So I spent a good year doing nothing but reading and boning up on my history. So I hope that comes through. I'm not David McCullough, but I'm doing a personal take on my sense of these places. So I think that hopefully will be pertinent as we go into this. It's inspiring, of course, to go to these places in person. There's no real replacement for that. Standing on the same steps as Clifton Hall, if any of you have been there in Germantown, and seeing the exact stone threshold where American soldiers died after a bloody battle and lay there, pictorialized in a painting that I think Howard Pyle did at one time. Also to hold the same banisters that Adams and Jefferson did in their own homes, and also to bump your head, as I did in many of these colonial homes, especially the Billups House in Staten Island, which is a very low ceiling, where General Howe met Adams and Franklin and Edward Rutledge in an attempt to negotiate a peace to the revolution, which didn't happen. And I devoted that in more detail. I chose 30 sites in all, kind of mixed it up between half very well known or mostly well known by many people, and another half lesser known. So I might get both readerships interested in the book. I interviewed people while I was there. I talked to scholars. So I tried to combine it into kind of like a talk of the town essay, if you will, and the New Yorker. That was sort of the model of some of it. As I wrote the book, there were lingering questions always that were in the back of my head, which is how in the world Americans even thought they had a chance at this revolution to win. The very day that they signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, they were completely aware that in the New York harbor there were 150 battleships, at least, that the English had, with well over 40,000 men, if not more. And yet they stuck to their resolve, and the rest, as they say, is history. Despite their heroism, I do touch on the less noble acts of the founding fathers. Certainly slavery, of course, plays a part, which was kind of lightly tossed over, it seems to me, in my high school textbooks. But I alluded to that when it was, I thought, appropriate. And also the Americans, some of their leaders like Washington had ulterior motives in some cases to speculate on land out west if they won the war. So there were some ulterior motives that weren't all squeaky clean. But at the same time, that wasn't really the nature of this book, so I had to kind of pull back a little bit, and that's for another book perhaps, or another author. So let's go into some of these images, which are all in the book. They're actually all, the originals are on display right now in Boston at my gallery, the Child's Gallery. If you're interested in just looking at those, I'm going to Boston. Now, let's see. Already the first casualty. I pressed this button. Okay, that closed. So this is just a map, too hard to see, but it shows all the different places that I visited, some of it interspersed with descriptions of the actual 13 colonies and so forth. But that's in the back of the book as a kind of a guide. This is Colonial Wilmsburg, which is, for those of you who have not been there, it's not a Disneyland. It's one of the most highly educational places you can go in the United States to learn about the colonial period. The actors there are incredibly well trained and informed, and they never leave character. They don't like come to your little kids and say, "Oh, how cute! Do you want an ice cream?" No, they'll stay in character, and it's astonishing how much knowledge they have. But this creation of Williamsburg, between the acting and the restoration, was billions and billions of dollars put together by the Rockefellers in the 20s and 30s. This is a map of a fatal march that Benedict Arnold, of all people, was General Washington's favorite general until he defected. And this was a march just before the signing of the Declaration in 1775, where the Americans attempted to attack a fort in Quebec. But this march through Maine and up to Quebec with 1,000 men ended up, half of them died of starvation, and the outcome was not good. But it's interesting that Benedict Arnold is the hero of this trek. This is, of course, an example of other things I did besides houses and battlefields. I did sculptures as well. This is Paul Revere in Boston, who actually was not as well known after he died as you might have thought. His name was resurrected by Longfellow in his famous poem. There were others who did the same call out to the Americans to let them know about the British, but their names, they didn't mind well enough. Know them. Of course, he would be well known just as a silversmith. He did nothing else. This is one of my favorite buildings that I went to. It's tucked right behind Independence Hall, Carpenter's Hall, where the first Continental Congress met before they moved into Independence Hall. But it's an extraordinarily beautiful Georgian-style classical building that is open to the public. When the Continental Congress met, They closed the shutters on the first floor so that the British couldn't hear them. The British, of course, were around in general, patrolling all these areas. This is another example of something I did a little different from houses and statues and whatnot. I tried to pictorialize some of the actual soldiers in the Revolution here at the Battle of Brooklyn. These also appear in the book. This is that house I alluded to in the beginning of bumping my head. I don't know if anyone's been there. It's at the furthest point of Staten Island on the Raritan Bay. And as I said, these three emissaries from the colonies came to meet Howe, and Howe said, look, let's pretend this never happened. We walloped you at the Battle of Brooklyn. No one's going to get hanged for treason. Just go your way, and we'll put this all aside. Well, the three emissaries said, no, you go. We've signed the declaration, you burned our houses, and we're sticking to this. So, but you can visit this house, and it's exactly the way it was when they went. This is, of course, Independence Hall. I did a version of it for the cover of the book on different color paper, if you're interested in watercolor. Also did one on white paper, which is in the interior of the book. A little variation. That's the one that's on the cover. Needs no introduction. I'm sure everyone has been there. This is Nassau Hall at Princeton, where the Battle of Princeton took place. It was once the tallest building, biggest building in the colonies. Princeton University, then known as the College of New Jersey. This was the whole college. Many of these colleges were very small. But the story goes that the British set up a garrison inside this very thick-walled structure, and Alexander Hamilton, apparently, with his artillery, shot a cannonball through one of the windows. Apparently it hit a portrait of King George III, and it crashed to the floor. That's the legend of this. This is John Adams's house, Peacefield, so-called, which is probably the most intact or one of the most intact of all the historic sites you can visit. It was stayed in the family for generations. All these famous Adams ancestors that you probably all know, Henry Adams, Charles Francis Adams, on and on, up until I think the 20s or 30s when it was finally turned over to an historic site. But there's not as much acreage as there once was, probably 300 or 400 acres at the time, but now it's just 5 acres. In Quincy, Massachusetts, then known as Braintree. This is a scene, actually, I did a little vignette from a larger painting done of this famous transport of cannon that General Henry Knox took from a fort in Ticonderoga to stave off the British in Boston. They snuck this, which was supposed to be a 2 or 3 week journey, ended up being 6 or 7 weeks, to drag these 26 cannons to the top of a hill in Boston, and it worked. And the British left. There's no way they can shoot cannonballs up, so the British were sunk, and the Americans had them. But the incredible story is this would have taken 2 days on North American van lines throwing in these cannons in a freight truck or a train, but back then there was nothing like that, so they had to do it by hand. This shows them disassembled over the snow. This is a building, Clifton, I mentioned a major battle took place at Germantown. This was various battles, Paoli, others, were all related to regaining Philadelphia, which the British thought would break the backs of the Americans. It was a major city. They had already occupied New York, and they occupied Manhattan for 8 or 7, or the entire length of the war, which people don't know. The evacuation day was celebrated when they finally sent them packing at the end of the war. It was celebrated all the way up until World War I, when they didn't think it was a good idea since we were allies with British at that time. So, but this is another historic site you can visit. This is, as you might guess, Valley Forge. These are replicas of the original cabins. I'm going to read a little more in depth later after this about that experience going there. This is a watercolor I made of another picture done by a British spy named Major John Andre. Does anyone know his name? Some of you do. Good. I'm in the right place. I confess I didn't know that much about him. Roger Angel of the New Yorker had a lot of knowledge about him because he used to somewhere upstate, not far from where this person was captured. He was captured holding the plans to West Point, which Benedict Arnold, who was not then known to be defective, had given him. And West Point was then a fort, not a military academy. But he was caught, and the amazing story is he was ordered by Washington to be executed, and on the day of his execution, he did a drawing of himself. He was a bon vivant, artistic person, a poet, well-known in British society, a young man, and he did a sketch of himself. And I discovered that that sketch in pen is at the Yale University Art Library, Museum, which you can go and request and see this little drawing. It's in perfect shape, except it's folded over. Remarkable document. This is also a little bit different from a house or a battlefield. These are the chain links of a famous chain that was built across the Hudson to stop the British from coming and going up the Hudson River in their ships. Whoever owned the Hudson really controlled the geography of the Revolution, if you will. And there's a few remaining chain links left, and they are on display at West Point. The efforts to make this gigantic chain, you can only imagine, was momentous at the time. This is Ben Franklin's printing press. You can visit it in Philadelphia. It's pretty much the same as it was, a little structure. We don't have Franklin's house anymore. That was burned or demolished a long time ago, but we do have his printing press headquarters, if you will, and I just drew in this figure for fun. This is a statue of Thomas Payne in New Rochelle, of all places. The United States gave him a farm of 300 acres as a thank you for all his efforts to spur on the revolution among the patriots, and it's a statue in that area. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is considered by some to be the most successful book ever published in the United States, because over 350,000 copies were sold. And you look per capita how many people there were, you kind of do the math and you realize there's never been anything like it. And you then wrote two other books, American Crisis and The Rights of Man. Complicated figure, but you have to read the book to learn more about it. This is a little sketch of paint watercolor of the area in the South, in the Georgia swamps and South Carolina swamps, where a very famous member of the American forces, Francis Marion, had a brigade of soldiers that would go and attack the British whenever they tried to make their move down there. The British had found that the first half of the war had been sort of a stalemate. They owned Manhattan, but not much else, and they had lost and regained Philadelphia. They thought, let's go to the South and weaken the Americans there. There were a lot of royalist leanings, at least they thought, which they could take advantage of. But this strategy of surprise attack like Robin Hood's brigade was very effective. Nathaniel Greene, the American general, was in charge of that. Francis Marion was an extremely famous person at the end of his life. And up until maybe even the 1950s, there was a Walt Disney TV series based on Marion. I don't think he's a name people know today. This is, as you might guess, Mount Vernon. I did an essay about him in my President's Homes book, so I chose to do the gardens in this case. He thought of himself as a gentleman, squire, farmer, probably more than anything else. He was very proud of being a planter. This is, hope some of you recognize this. I did this in a little different watercolor style. This still exists. It's downtown. Well, all of these things exist. There's no point about this book because you can visit these. But this is St. Paul's Chapel downtown near the World Trade Center. And Washington lived in New York City, in Manhattan, for 2 solid years. Most people don't know that. This was after the Revolution when he was president. This was the Capitol and a house on Cherry Street. And he worshipped every Sunday at St. Paul's. He also witnessed the first Columbia College graduation. It was King's College before the war, but after that it was Columbia, and he attended this. There was probably 12 students back then. This is Lafayette Statue in Washington, Lafayette Park, I guess. And he deserves to be known as a founding father. There's no figure more significant in the Revolution than this man, although he was French. The French alliance was critical to winning the war. They might have had ulterior motives on some level because they despised the English so much. But this was a man who truly believed in all the ideals of democracy and the American cause. He was also one of Washington's dearest friends. There's a whole thought that it was like the son he never had, because Washington didn't have his own children, and they were extremely close. Lafayette also tried to convince him to get rid of his slaves. It was, at least he got him talking about it. It didn't ultimately work, but they had an interesting exchange. This is a curiosity in some ways. This looks like Monticello, and if you think it is, you're close. But Thomas Jefferson built a weekend house for himself. It's very similar. It's like a mini Monticello called Poplar Forest. He had escaped actually from a British attack to try to kidnap him, and he had run to an area that his father-in-law owned, a large piece of land called Poplar Forest. He would later build a mini Monticello as a getaway weekend place for himself to relax when he could escape the celebrity that he had acquired after the war. This is Weathersfield, Connecticut, the house where Rochambeau, the French general, who worked with Washington to, in this very house, to plan the victory at Yorktown. The French alliance was, as I said, absolutely critical. The money, the men, Americans could never have won without them. And to Rochambeau's credit, he gave deference to Washington, who didn't have 12 last names like Rochambeau did, but Rochambeau, who didn't speak any English, everything had to be through translation. They collaborated. And this is Rochambeau himself in a statue in Newport, where he first was stationed with his ships and waited for the call of duty, which came 3 or 4 months later. This is the scene of Yorktown, the battlefield, a little more picturesque than I'm sure the soldiers remember. I think we're coming to the end. This is the Maryland State House, where George Washington resigned his commission. Piece of paperwork, sounds about as sexy as getting a driver's license, but it was critical to show that he honestly believed that he was done. He had no interest in the power that he had acquired and became a deity, really. They were even thinking of making him a king, as bizarre as that sounds. They just tried to get rid of one. Now they were thinking of making him a king. But he resigned his commission as general. He would later, of course, become president. But there you could go and see the same chambers where this happened, and there's a statue of Washington there. So that's that. What I'm going to do now is read one excerpt from the book, give you a flavor of the writing, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions. This is about Valley Forge, called Winter of Discontent. Valley Forge Historic Site, King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. If you Google George Washington at Valley Forge, chances are you'll come across a picture by Arnold Freeburg, painted in 1975. It shows Washington kneeling alone in the snow, his hands clasped in prayer. Washington was a deeply religious man, and it's possible he did in fact pray. He certainly had reason to. Some 2,000 of his men had died that winter in early spring of 1777 to 78, many from disease or starvation, in what would become a horrific 6 months. On February 16, 1778, in the midst of the crisis, the general wrote to Governor Clinton of New York, "For some days past, there's been little less than a famine in camp. A part of the army has been a week without any kind of flesh and rest for 3 or 4 days. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery." Washington pleaded with Congress for more supplies, but received little for his pains. Congress was hampered by scarcity of money, failure of credit, and an inefficient administrative system mired in bureaucratic wrangling. Meanwhile, Washington's army was reeling from a string of defeats in Pennsylvania during the spring of 1777, at Paoli, Brandywine, Germantown. Each had been an attempt to win back Philadelphia, as I had mentioned, a major colonial city from the British. Washington could no longer afford to wait for Congress to act. He tried instead to purchase food from the locals around Valley Forge, but met with resistance. Farmers would rather sell to the English, whose currency was more valuable. Furthermore, some of these farmers were reluctant because of their loyalist leanings. Why support a fight against people who had the same language, religion, and customs? Pennsylvania, like New York and most of the South, had a sizable population that sided with the Crown. In desperation, Washington was forced to confiscate food supplies from the neighboring residents, something he felt morally opposed to. Given these hardships at Valley Forge, then how did the Continental Army stay together, and how did the men continue to fight? In the fall of 2019, I set out to find some answers. Traveling by car, I headed out of New York toward Valley Forge National Park. The address on my navigation system read 1400 North Outer Line Drive, King of Prussia, PA. I took I-95 south through New Jersey and Pennsylvania. For much of the time, the only scenery seemed to be numbing stretches of smokestacks and oil storage tanks. The interstate was bumper to bumper. Fumes were sickening. When I finally got near the park, I was confronted with shopping malls and high-rise developments. This wasn't exactly what I expected of my scenic tour. It reminded me of other car trips I've taken on highways that have changed over the years into fast food chains. Things, however, changed as soon as I passed through the gates of Valley Forge. White lines and exit ramps gave way to the beauty of open fields, mature trees, and stone walls. Wooden fence posts lined the narrow, curving roads. I arrived at the visitor center and made a beeline for the reception desk. I was told to contact Park Ranger Bill Trotman, who had been assigned to give me a private tour at 3 o'clock. The office assistant wrote down his cell number, and I called him. "I'm running a bit late," Bill said. "I was just firing muskets near one of the cabins." Perfect, I thought, I'm in the right place. After a short wait, I spotted a figure in the gift shop where I was standing, who had just arrived, dressed in a brown and green uniform. It was Bill, a big man with thick white hair, broad shoulders, and a husky voice. He reminded me of a football coach. "Sorry to keep you," he said. "I was changing out of my soldier's clothes. I was doing a reenactment for a school group. Let's hop in my car." It was a late November afternoon, but Bill assured me we would get in as much of the tour as possible before evening set in. We climbed into his white SUV just as it began to drizzle and wove through the park's serpentine byways. "This area was originally established by Quakers in the 1740s, he told me. They founded the Mountjoy Forge here and formed a small industrial community. Over time, they expanded the ironworks and built mills and houses. The surrounding acreage was rich farmland for growing wheat, rye, Indian corn, and hay. Washington's quartermaster, Thomas Mifflin, had scouted the area near the Schuylkill River and decided it was a good place to camp because it was secluded between two hills. Our first stop was a row of log cabins, as I showed you the picture. They were built by our soldiers themselves and by Washington's orders," Bill said. "There was prize money for the best ones." Construction began immediately upon arrival at the camp on December 19, 1777, because the troops had no barracks to sleep in and winter had set in. The men had grown up on farms in New England, so they knew how to build things. They made the chimneys out of wood because it was too labor-intensive to make stone ones. Originally, there were hundreds of these cabins, Bill said, in long rows. We have 10 replicas on display. We entered one of the cabins. A fire was crackling in the hearth. I eyed the bunk beds and the dirt floor. The room was dark and damp. The exposed walls were caked with mud and straw to keep out the draft. There were no windows. Poor air circulation, I learned, led to stuffy, often foul-smelling spaces that were ripe for spreading disease. You can imagine how many trees were cut down for these cabins, Bill went on. They were built to house some 11,000 soldiers. There were about 12 men per cabin, each about 14 by 16 in length. They all needed wood to keep the bake ovens running. There were thousands of loaves of bread needed to feed the soldiers per day. He spoke passionately about the history of Valley Forge. The rebel army had been in dire need of basic necessities like blankets, he said, and the desertion rate was close to 20%. He talked about the meager rations, often just watery soup made from bone marrow. Sometimes the men boiled fat, I hope you'll have a better dinner later tonight. In 2019, Bill had been working at Valley Forge for over 27 years. I was a high school teacher for 10 years before that, he said. It takes a lot of training to be a ranger. The National Parks requires us, in addition to our history education, to be peace officers. That means instruction on using firearms, driving emergency vehicles, and arrest techniques. In between my hours here, though, I'm writing a book on Benjamin Franklin. Just a couple of chapters left. Back in the car, we continued on our tour. Our next stop was George Washington's headquarters, a fieldstone building with white trim characteristic of the Delaware Valley. Bill pointed out the flag in front, a replica that had 13 stars, one for each of the colonies. This was one of the first flags of the new republic, he said. In front of this house, we went on, there would have been Washington's elite guards assigned to protect him, Bill said. There were about 50 of them, kind of like the Secret Service today. You needed a password before they let you in. Our final destination was another statue I'd mentioned an earlier one. This one of a man in a long cloak and hat standing atop a stone pedestal. Baron Van Steuben, Bill said. He was an unsung hero of the Revolution. He was a former officer in the Prussian War. Some questioned whether he was an actual baron. Regardless, he had a lot of experience in military maneuvers and drills and had written a manual on the subject. He was hired to teach the ragtag troops how to get in shape. By the time the Americans left Valley Forge for good in June 1778, the soldiers had been transformed into a disciplined army, Bill told me. Come back again December 19th, Bill said. That's when we do a reenactment of the army entering the camp on that same date in 1777. I dress up sometimes, but not every year. I'm getting a bit old for this kind of stuff. I know my time is coming because a third grader came up to me the other day and asked if I'd ever met George Washington. Can you believe it? I said no, but I did know Thomas Jefferson. Thank you. So that's a slightly longer essay if you read the whole thing, and there's 30 more of them. So in any case, I'll take a moment if anyone has any questions, comments. There's one.
I wonder why you only showed one scene of the lower south, the swamp scene in Carolina, because it was a Southern campaign that drove Cornwallis to Yorktown, surrendering the loss of America.
Yes, I focused really on the southern ones, and basically Annapolis, Yorktown, and then a chapter on Francis Marion. Could have done more. It was I put some also in the back of the book. There are, because I had to cover all of the things I didn't do, and some things I couldn't go into whole essays and write. There's just so much space in the book. So in the back, there are some other sites noted. There's a mill in North Carolina where a battle took place where the British tried to take hostage a colonial governor. The battle of, that's in the back of the book, I don't remember the name of it, and a couple of others I mentioned in brief in the back. But that was an important part of the campaign. Most in the war, per number, there might have been more battles there than in the North, but not always as well known. Any other questions? There's one.
Does your book suggest an itinerary to take?
Not necessarily. I mean, I guess I would, it's not sort of a guidebook per se, but it could be used as somewhat like that. I arranged the order of the essays and the sites based on chronology of the war. So the first ones, with some exceptions, like some were houses that don't have this particular date, but the ones that relate to battlefields and events, I did those sort of chronologically. That's why that first slide, one of the first slides of Benedict Arnold's, the map on his trek to Canada was shown because that was 1775, before the Declaration was signed. But it was interesting just seeing that progression. And there's also a timeline in the back of the book that's quite extensive, which lists all of this in more detail, and a bibliography for those who want to explore further. I would say of all the 70 or 80 books that I read or partially read, the most extraordinary is a book that was published in 1850, something like that. I found at the Yale Library, a small book, the original edition. It's been recopied, no doubt, but it was a series of 8 interviews of surviving members of the revolution who are now over 100. And they recount their memories of being soldiers and knowing Washington firsthand. It's fascinating, partly because they use expressions and terms that were common to them that are no longer used. So you'd have to kind of figure that out. I mean, silly thing like knee-high to a grasshopper. They would have, we know what that means now, but they use things like that in this colloquial conversation between them and the interviewer, and expressions that are long gone. But one of them included a drummer boy who was 10 and signed up, and he remembered Washington very, very distinctly. And they describe how the soldiers were terrified because he would be riding back and forth in the front of the firing line, rallying them on in his white horse and this big hat or whatever. And they were like, what is he doing there? He's going to be shot. But that's evidence of his fearlessness. But there are it's worth looking at. I've forgotten the name of the book, but quite memorable. Another question?
It's not about the book, but yesterday I was at Christie's by Rock Center and to look at something and stumbled upon Delaware crossing the Delaware.
Washington crossing the Delaware?
Yes,
Yeah.
there's a smaller version of the massive one that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's for sale.
Wow.
So I don't know if the viewing is still available to, if you're staying in town, if it's.
So this looks quite similar to the.
It looks very similar, and you can get so close to it, and you see the boats in the background of maybe the troops and the cannons and the horses, whatever. And I had, as many times as I looked at the huge fort, I never noticed it for some reason. And here you were like inches from the canvas, and you could focus on.
No, that's fascinating.
So
And
if
for
the
those.
viewing is still open, it may have been sold last time.
Well, thank you. I'll have to see if I check. My credit card can manage that. After selling a few books, then. No, but if anyone hasn't seen the large new frame around the large version of the net, that's of course an amazing experience. And that deserves all the hype around that crossing the Delaware. I mean, the Delaware is actually not that long or wide, so it's kind of not that deep either. But aside from that, it was full of ice and so forth. But that was really an absolute turning point. If you get into the history of the war, Washington was absolutely desperate. This was a Hail Mary, if you know that expression, and he had nothing to lose, but he knew another battle lost and it was over. And he did something that is really against his character, because you're not supposed to fight during Christmas. That was gentleman's agreement between officers, but he set out on Christmas Eve and did this and surprised the Hessians. He came later than he thought. The plans got screwed up, it took too long, but he prevailed. And that gave them the momentum to feel like they could take on the British at Princeton and other places. So it deserves to be, celebrated in all of the books and some of the painting. One last question.
So, how does it feel different painting history versus writing about history? Do you have a big difference?
Well, that's a very good question. It's.
That was the question.
How does it feel to write history versus painting history? Yes, well, there are two sides of my brain, not easy to sort out sometimes because I was doing both often simultaneously. They're very different experiences. I kept trying to keep McCullough's advice to me. Writing is like painting with words, because he likes to paint pictures. He was actually a very good painter, and still is, but he thought of things that way, and that helped me. But it's a very different, for those of you who've done both or one or the other, there are very different ways to, I mean, for me it was a bit challenging because I've painted ever since I was a child. Writing I've done more in my later years. So that comes a little more naturally for me. So I could whip off these paintings somewhat quickly, but the writing took more time. And, you know, for those of you who are writers, you lie in bed trying to adjust commas and semicolons and rush into the computer because of one word. And the endless revisions that writing requires is a very different experience. But they both did bring all of this history down into your soul, really, because you have to articulate and express it and rethink it all. And you have to also give it back to others to experience. And that's the challenge, right? To make it interesting. Because, I mean, there's millions of ways to have been to recount the revolution. But how do you make it so that people want to go there and revisit this, maybe in books or in their own mind? You have to make it just like a painting, compelling as you would a narrative. And I try to spin stories, if you will, to get people interested, because of course it's an amazing period of our history. And again, quoting Mr. McCullough, who I've quoted a lot, if you're out there, Dave, he said it takes a genius to make history boring. And God knows we've done that in our schools. You know, people just recoil. Jay, you have a question?
Well, not a question, but a footnote or a comment, which is, I guess it's on Christie's website, I saw that elsewhere, a deconstruction of the painting, Washington Cross in Delaware, identifies the various soldiers and participants in the painting. That's actually, I think, the third version. The first, we all know that the painting was painted in Germany, in Dusseldorf, in Lloyd's studio, and as an opening reception, they had a miniature cannon. They set it off and it set the paint on fire.
Oh my God! That's
So
wonderful.
they had to start over, and then the smaller version was so they could do a print reproduction. And at one point, that painting actually belonged to Bill Middendorf, who had been Secretary of the Navy and ambassador to Holland. And he sold it decades ago, and ultimately it was the little version. It's not so little.
Yes, yes. No, that's fascinating. I couldn't really, you could write a whole book if it's
And
not been done.
at least one American painter, two, Eastman Johnson and Worthington Whitridge, were students. And apparently, I think it was Whitridge who posed for one of the figures because the Germans were too small to fit into the American uniforms.
Isn't that extraordinary? Wow. I didn't know that. It's also a great example. Sometimes outsiders have a better view of what's going on than those in the center. Although John Trumbull is a great artist, he did many scenes of the revolution. Leitz is, of course, he's probably the most famous. I didn't know he did it in Germany. I thought he did it here.
No.
But that's interesting. So I'm getting some cues that maybe it's time to.
Actually, we've got a couple of questions in the live stream, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. That's what you're pointing to. Who am I supposed to look this way? Or?
Just whatever first you
Yes.
So, a question about Thomas Payne, who I admit I also kind of love. You mentioned he's per capita the most successful author. It's fascinating. Also made me think, this is just out of my head, reminded me of Lincoln's perhaps apocryphal quote about Harriet Beecher Stowe, you're the little lady who started this great war, and Thomas Payne was the author who started the, et cetera. But if he's so successful, I have the feeling he was not very financially successful personally, though. What was his personal legacy?
He wasn't. I didn't, read everything about him, but he invested a lot of money. He had a lot of ideas. Very restless person. He was also an inventor trying to come up with a bridge design, a truss bridge design. I think he invested a lot of money in the patent and so forth, and that failed. I think he would have made money certainly on his books if he was a good bookkeeper. But I think the peripatetic, there's an SAT word, lifestyle he had, traveling back and forth between America and England, and he was in France for a while. I just wonder how much he was able to accumulate his wealth. or whether he even had a contract with whoever published that. So, but he did not die a wealthy man. He died in poverty, and you can go, and I think I mentioned this in the book, you can go downtown in the West Village, there's a plaque on Grove Street where he supposedly died in a rooming house there. It's called Marie's Crisis. It's a famous bar or music place. Right next to it is a jazz club called Arthur's Tavern. But there's a little plaque put up at the Greenwich Village Historical Society in 1829, which commemorates Payne there. But he is a true founding father. He didn't say anything new, nothing original in any of his books, but he said it with such incredible prose, and he was accessible to the masses, not the dumbing it down, but he didn't use references to Aristotle and Plato like Adams and Jefferson would have, but all those famous phrases, you know, summer soldier, sunshine patriot, all these things, but he said it in a way that reached the Americans and made them understand what this cause was about. So he deserves tremendous credit. And Washington read his, Washington read the Declaration of Independence downtown at City Hall. There's a marker where he did that. But I think he read some of I do know Washington read Common Sense and was very moved by it. Benjamin Franklin met Payne in England and invited him to come to America. There's another question from the...
Yes, we did have a comment to say your paintings are lovely from the live stream as well. So another question is, I haven't heard many historians speak about the current conflict with Russia and Ukraine. When we think of the alliance between the French and the colonists during the time of the Revolution and the criticality of that alliance against an objectively larger power, are there lessons learned in this time?
Right. Well, I think one lesson which seems to be recurrent throughout history is when you invade a country where the natives are fighting for their own land, it's a tough hill to climb, because we've seen it in Vietnam, in Afghanistan. I mean, 10 years the Russians were in Afghanistan. Of course, we were as well. But it was a little bit different, and the Russians could not prevail with large tanks against people on bicycles. How does that work? And the Vietnamese were willing to live under tunnels for 4 or 5 years to keep their homeland, and we're seeing that in Ukraine, and we certainly saw it in the United States. The irony is, I talk about, what did the Americans think when they were taking on this cause at the time and pledging their lives. Some of these men who are the founding fathers were very young. The median age was 43 of the signers. Jefferson was only 33. They had vast estates, huge families, beautiful homes, a wine cellar like you wouldn't believe. I don't think the Stamp Act, the cost of getting a stamp on documents really mattered to them financially. So, you wonder, I talked about in the introduction in some detail my thoughts about what drove them, but it is kind of fascinating. In fact, the British, when they fought at the Battle of Long Island, the soldiers were amazed when they went through these farmlands, and raided homes presumably too, how well appointed these farmhouses were. They thought to themselves, these people are living very well. It's kind of apropos, maybe the Russian thing, where they painted the Ukrainians as living, in squalor, Nazis or whatever. Maybe the British had done their own propaganda, but the soldiers on the British were astounded. They lived better than they did. And of course, America was already had 120 years or so of settlement. And that's a long time to chop trees and make homes and make places. So, but they had very nice furniture. Anyway, all this to this complicated thing of, it wasn't like a police state. The control the British had, they were not as severe as you might think to war and to revolution. They were 3,000 miles away. There were members of parliament like Edmund Burke who felt very strongly, leave the Americans alone. This is enough already. They've obviously grown bigger than we thought. Give them their independence and move on. So there was even sympathy there. But, and the British had lots of other colonies to worry about. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's in the book. Was there another question from?
I just have one more question. Have you ever considered leading a trip to some of the venues mentioned in your current book, likewise for the stones at Yale?
No, I don't quite understand the question.
Might you consider?
a tour bus.
Oh, a tour of somebody. I hadn't thought about that. Maybe sponsored by the New York Society Library. Footsteps, in the founder's footsteps. Yeah, we'll have lunch in Staten Island and move on from there. No, I haven't made any plans for that. It sounds like a good idea, though.
When you teach at Yale, because you're an artist, but do you teach history or do you teach art?
Another very good question. The mystery of Adam Van Dorn. How does he do it, right? Well, I teach a course actually that combines painting and art history together. And I teach it in the humanities department. I teach it as a course, a fine arts course that in the past, maybe a long time ago, 75, maybe more, 100 years ago, fine arts, learning to paint rather, was considered one of the liberal arts. That's all gone. So I'm kind of and thanks to Yale for letting me do this, I'm trying to reintroduce this skill, which I think is even more powerful now than it ever was because they're on their phones, and they're learning a tactile skill. But they learn art history through the act of actually painting and learning to paint. So it's kind of like what I'm doing in these books. The two sides of their brain are being educated, if you will, to learn how to be scholars of art and also to be practitioners of it. And I use the medium of watercolor because that's the most accessible for a student who's also majoring in physics or biochemistry, which half my class is STEM majors, so-called, what STEM is, it's the science courses. Because you can't really do oil paint and then clean your brushes and run to a class and stink of oil and all of that. So watercolor allows that. They can finish the painting, throw it in the knapsack, and head to the next class. So they have to write papers for me. Some of them go visit the Yale Art Gallery and look at a painting and then write about it. I have them read if you all remember Sir Kenneth Clark.
Yes.
But this is the New York Society Library. Why would I ask a question like that? You probably all saw the Civilization series in 1975, which is on Amazon. I've seen it again. But he wrote a short book called What is a Masterpiece? Kind of an impossible question. He thought it was still relevant and that you could identify a work. He had grown up, probably born in 1870 when you could think along those lines. It was waning then when he wrote it, but he really makes an attempt at it. And I have them try to, by his criteria, look at a painting in the Yale Art Gallery, which are many of them, and see does it fit the criteria of Clark's of what. It's a great essay, by the way. You know that essay, Jay?
No, I was just going to, you mentioned the Civilization series. Of course, we grew up learning art history with Jansen. Jansen's wife, Dora Jansen, was a jewelry historian. And at the same time the Civilization series was on, the Forsyth Saga was on PBS. She referred to Kenneth Clark's Civilization series as the Hindsight Saga.
Well, I have seen it again, and I don't, what's the word, binge? I don't have a smartphone, that's another thing. I don't binge watch. I watch that whole series again. And if you just get past, okay, he's in tweets, he's an older professor type, which we didn't maybe notice as much back then. He is wonderful. And he takes you through every segment of that series, just focusing on 4 or 5, maybe 6 major things within that era. So he doesn't do this whirlwind. And I find it fascinating. I found it fascinating. So it's a good plug for Kenneth Clark. He was so astounded, absolutely astounded by his celebrity on this show. He was a well-known art historian, But he was in tears when they did the preview at Washington at the National Gallery for the PBS series, and he saw the throngs of people. I guess they had seen it maybe elsewhere in their formal screening, that gave him the standing ovation that he had brought to the masses, an understanding of Western art. And he had never known this kind of fame which television can get you, I guess, but to his credit, and that he even offered to do this in person. He's not an actor. Who knew we got into Kenneth Clark? That was a book that I do assign my students. He's kind of a forgotten figure now. Anyway, it's a long answer to your question and yours, that these are two different disciplines that I have dealt with, but I ask my students to do the same, so we're all in it together. Just a seminar, 15 students. I just finished the last class last week, so they're free for the semester. I'm grading their papers. And that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.